Bismillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be upon you. Welcome to this episode of The Scholar and the Student. I'm your host, Moss. Today, we have another book review lined up for you. Last time, we reviewed a book called Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. And before I got into that review proper, I did spend a good portion of 20 minutes talking about the need to actually read fiction, why reading fiction is important, why reading in general is important, something that we must all aspire to do, be us Muslims or otherwise, and also why I chose a fiction book with elements of magic as the first choice for the book review in The Scholar and the Student, Botswana's first Muslim podcast. Unfortunately, this is still a bad podcast to learn how to cook paliche, because I do not know how to do that. I do actually do a good job, however, at eating paliche, although I am afraid I cannot show you how to do that within the confines of my recording equipment. That being said, now that I have your attention, I think we should get into the review proper. The book that we are going to review this week, which I have also read or listened to by way of Audible, which is an awesome app. Please go check it out. This is not sponsored. I listened to it on Audible 4 times, just as I listened to Howl's Moving Castle 4 times. The last time, obviously, was, of course, for the purposes of this review, and so that I could take notes that I would refer to every now and again. And then there was obviously a process of reviewing and actually finalizing, crystallizing those notes, so I have something concrete to work with for the purposes of this review. And this week's book is also written by Diana Wynne Jones, and also another fiction book with plenty of magic to go around. So if you had a heart attack the last time because we were doing a fiction book with magic elements, have even a bigger one this time. I am radioactive, and I'm definitely unapologetic about that. Castle in the Air by Diana Wynne Jones is the book we're going to review for this week. I'll say that again, Castle in the Air. And it definitely takes place within the same universe as Howl's Moving Castle. In fact, it is actually the second in the series of the Howl's Moving Castle series of books. Howl's Moving Castle was obviously the first, and then this is the second. We will get to the third and final entry in the series somewhere down the line. I will keep you at the tip of suspense regarding that for now. Now, that being said, although I do take pride in my ability to be radioactive and give people heart attacks, we are cognizant of the fact that this is a Muslim podcast, although what we may be discussing doesn't always have to be from the Quran and from the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, like directly from there, but we take a Muslim lens and we analyze books and whatever else have you, and obviously wherever we can take a lesson, we will take it from there, because there is a hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and the loose translation of it is something to this effect, that wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Meaning that if you find an element of wisdom anywhere, a book, something that you've listened to, something that you've seen, then you take it as if it is your long lost property, and you are anxious to make it a part of your life. That is how we treat wisdom. So in line of us being a Muslim podcast, and in line with myself as the host of this podcast being someone who does his best to uphold Islamic values, we do need to go through some disclaimers. Although it won't be as long as last time going through the whole process of explaining why reading is important and why we had to choose a fiction book, this time the disclaimers that we have are more in line of, shall I say, making us aware about things in this book which may be problematic from an Islamic perspective, and it's not just the magic elements and what have you. Yes, I did say in the previous episode that we need to grow a backbone, and that we need to not be insecure about our values. And just because someone is writing about people drinking or people eating bacon in a book, that doesn't mean that it's going to compromise my values at all. And that doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater, that we discard that book and burn it in the trash just because it had a couple of lines regarding those things. However, with Castle in the Air, because this is a book that is inspired heavily by Middle Eastern culture. It goes without saying that if there is someone who is listening to this podcast who is interested in Islam, or someone who is a Muslim but wants to learn more about Islam, it goes without saying, I shouldn't have to explain this, but just as a disclaimer, by virtue of good faith and the kind of duty that we have as hosts of The Scholar and the Student, Botswana's first Muslim podcast, we don't base anything Islamic or any Islamic knowledge off of this book. It is more Oriental than Islamic because a lot of it takes huge inspiration from 1001 Arabian Nights, which is a very famous collection of stories. Whether it is actually from Arabia, that is something debatable. In fact, many scholars actually place its origin somewhere in Persia, which would be more understandable with the way that some of these characters are named and so on and so forth. And maybe some others may be familiar with some of the stories that we find in 1001 Arabian Nights, such as Aladdin, and I'm going to pronounce it like that. Do not hold me to account to make me say it that it's Aladdin, it's Aladdin. I don't care, okay? And there's a reason why I don't care, because stories, the more popular stories such as Aladdin, which is very popular thanks to the Disney iterations of that, and also Sinbad, these stories, interesting enough, there is actually some debate or discussion about the fact of whether these are actually part of the original manuscript of 1001 Nights, because there are plenty of sources that say that there were actually later editions by translators who were translating these works into various different languages. They are the ones who introduced these stories. So that's why I'm going to say it as Aladdin. It's probably not even an Arab story to begin with. In fact, many of these stories are probably, I have a hunch that they are probably Persian in origin. Not to say that they are bad, but once again, they have very un-Islamic themes sometimes, themes that are more rooted in some sort of Oriental culture, be it pre-Islamic Arabian culture or some sort of Persian culture, the forced marriages and, men having an infinite number of wives, whereas women do not count, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of blatant misogyny in this book that is part and parcel of the culture of the people of Zanzibar, which is where our protagonist hails from in this book. Now, it's just a disclaimer that obviously we're not going to follow these misogynistic points. We are not going to internalize misogyny. And also, it goes without saying that these are not representative of Islam in any way or form. They are more representative of the source material, which is 1001 Arabian Nights, and more representative of the Orientalist culture that those stories actually emanated from. I hope I have made myself very clear on that point. Also, carrying on from the Orientalist point, there are plenty of genies. Well, there is one genie in the story, and an actual genie like the one we have in Aladdin who grants wishes. There's a magic carpet, just like Aladdin again. Interesting, I believe that, this book was published 4 years after Howl's Moving Castle. Howl's Moving Castle was published in 1986, and this book was published in 1990. The animated Disney film Aladdin, I don't think that came out until somewhere late into the 90s, so I wouldn't say Diana Wynne Jones had that at the back of our mind, but obviously the story in its various forms and iterations and translations existed from, a very long time ago. So that's interesting to note, but there are Djinns as well. So Djinns, I know a lot of Muslims might say that, the genie in Aladdin is kind of a very loose representation of a Djinn. In the world of Castle in the Air, which is the same world as Howl's Moving Castle, which Diana Wynne Jones has created, Djinns and genies seem to be two separate types of creatures. For those of you who may be a bit alien to Muslim tradition or the Arab tradition in general, not saying that all Muslims are Arabs or that Muslims have some, all Muslims have to follow some sort of Arabian culture or whatever. But what I am saying is that a Djinn, just to make you understand, I guess you could literally translate it into demon. In Arabic, Djinn, and I've done a bit of reading into this as well, Djinn can literally mean anything that is not seen with naked eye. Some writers actually refer to insects and what have you as Djinn, and it's not referring to any one thing in particular, but just to make it very clear to you, in everyday terminology, it could be referring to some otherworldly being or a sort of demon or what have you. So in the universe of Castle in the Air, they are a specific type of creature, which I guess you could call a demon. They've got wings, they're pretty hideous, and so on and so forth. But they're not like Calcifer, the fire demon from Howl's Moving Castle. It's made quite apparent that Calcifer and the Djinns are different species entirely, and then the Genie himself is something else. So there was some interesting background to the novel we are going to read today. So how I'm going to structure this is, before I get into the actual themes of the novel, I will go over about a third of the plot, just as I did last time. Obviously, going over the entire plot would be counter to the objectives of this book review, because one of the objectives that we hope is being fulfilled by these book reviews is that you get inspired to go and purchase these books and actually read them for yourself, and then obviously come up with your own opinions and formulate your own lessons that you derive from these books. And that is why I did not assign a number rating to Howl's Moving Castle, because if I give it a low number, no one's going to go and buy it and get it, and so on and so forth. The objective of these reviews is simply to inspire people to go out there and pick up these books for themselves so that they can actually read them. It's to encourage other people to actually go out and read. So there will be no number rating. I will be chiming in every now and again about what works for me and what could, in my opinion, have been done better every now and again. Well, that might not be so prevalent because I am literally in love with the way Diana Wynne Jones writes. I hope that that won't be an impediment. I mean, I made that point very clear in the last episode as well, that I am really, really in love with the way Diana Wynne Jones writes, and the way she presents her prose in this novel. The language of the people of Zanzibar is very flowery and, in my opinion, very beautiful. Of course, it's got its own pros and cons, which I will delve into later on in this review. So, yeah, first of all, the plot of Castle in the Air. So, the main character, our protagonist in Castle in the Air, his name is Abdullah. Now, Abdullah in Arabic simply means the slave of Allah, or the slave of God. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that this novel is more Oriental than Islamic, and having the main protagonist be called Abdullah doesn't take away from that, because, look, it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that pre-Islamic Arabs also used the name Abdullah because it just means the slave of God. I mean, of course, pre-Islamic Arabs, maybe it wasn't completely a monotheistic understanding, but they did have an understanding of who God was. Of course, this is not a story that's based, I mean, it's not written in those times, but is definitely taking a lot of inspiration from a story that may or may not have originated from those times. So that's something to be cognizant of. I don't think Diana Wynne Jones was being purposefully malicious or Islamophobic against Muslims or whatever the case may be. I think this is just trying to stay true as possible to 1001 Arabian Nights, problems and all with that collection, while writing an original story. So anyway, the protagonist, Abdullah, he lives in the Sultanate of Zanzibar, which is in a desert, and this desert, well, the Sultanates of Rajput, I believe they're called, they are located somewhere south of the land of Ingary. And remember the land of Ingary from Howl's Moving Castle, that's where Howl's Moving Castle took place. So Abdullah is a young carpet merchant, and he is doing okay, rather well. There's nothing much to complain about, but he does have these grand daydreams. His father quite recently passed away, and it was made known to Abdullah that his father was disappointed in him. And it's not exactly clear why his father was so disappointed in him, but his father did leave him enough to start this carpet booth of his. His father's first wife's relations, and I don't know if I can keep saying that for the entirety of this podcast. His father's first wife's relations, I'm just going to call them Abdullah's relatives from now on, you get who it is, but to once again emphasize that they are his father's first wife's relations, they don't get on so well with Abdullah. Abdullah is the child of his father's second wife, all right? So he doesn't get on well with these relatives of his, and they are rather horrid, as we will see further on. They are quite manipulative. In fact, I shouldn't be using quite to describe their ways of manipulation, But anyway, that'll come further on. They often pester Abdullah to make more profit or to invest in his carpet business with the profits he makes, or to get married and so on and so forth. But after Abdullah uses his wit to get rid of them, they usually don't pester him for a month. So that's that. And then Abdullah himself often has daydreams about, first of all, he has daydreams of himself and his past, about how his father, the one who's disappointed in him, isn't his real father, but in actuality, he is a prince of a distant land, somewhere far away from Zanzibar to the east. And as an infant, about 2 years old, he was kidnapped by the legendary bandit leader Kabul Akbar. And I don't know how I would actually pronounce that if I had seen it written down. I have only listened to the audiobook of Castle in the Air 4 times, of course, and that's how Jenny Sterling, solid performance by the way, that's how she pronounces it, so it's Kabul Akbar. I don't think I'll be referring to him too often, but anyway, Abdullah's daydream so goes that he was kidnapped by this person and his band of bandits, and somehow, when he was kidnapped, he escaped, and then in the desert, middle of the desert somewhere, the man whom he grew up knowing as his father, in other words, the guy who was disappointed in Abdullah, found him there and took him back home, therefore adopting him. And it was a complete castle in the air, a complete daydream. There is no evidence that such a thing ever happened, and it just doesn't make sense because people from Zanzibar, where Abdullah is from, do not generally venture out into the desert like that. It's an act of madness, they say, because it's almost for certain that you will never come back, or you'll come back as a corpse. So that's that. And also Abdullah has other daydreams about himself getting married, or at least being together with this princess in a fabulous sort of garden, and she's a very beautiful princess. You get the gist. I'm sure many of the guys here may be able to relate, because, hey, yeah, maybe we've all had those kinds of daydreams at some point in life. Anyway, so those are the daydreams that Abdullah has. And it so happens that one day, Abdullah chances upon this stranger who has come into this booth, and he sells Abdullah a carpet, but it's not just any type of carpet. It looks rather ordinary. In fact, it looks rather shabby. It looks like it's going to, basically it's been through a lot. The patchwork is not that great. The threads are coming off. It is of an interesting blue color though. And the stranger sells it to Abdullah, telling him it is a magic carpet. And he even demonstrates at Abdullah's bequest. He tells the carpet to rise up 2 feet, and so it does. And Abdullah, wanting to make extra sure that it is definitely magic and it's not just something specific to this trader this person who's selling him this magic carpet, he gets on it and he himself tells it to rise 2 feet, and it does. So, convinced that it is indeed a magic carpet, Abdullah purchases this carpet after a lot of bargaining, as is the custom of Zanzibar, and he has, I guess, somehow doubt creeps into him. And he begins to think, well, there are incidents of people selling other animals such as dogs and camels, but these dogs and camels are trained such that when the person who has purchased them falls asleep in the middle of the night, they escape and go back to the one who was doing the selling. So it's a scheme, a money-making scheme. So he is afraid this carpet might be enchanted to do the same. So what he does is that he sleeps on this carpet that night. And when he awakes, he doesn't awake in the morning. He awakes somewhere in the middle of the night, and he awakes to see that he is in the garden of his dreams. So naturally, he thinks he's dreaming. Also, in the garden of his dreams, he sees, wait for it, he sees a very, very beautiful young girl. And although she didn't match the exact description of the girl of his daydreams, he hastily adjusted his daydream to make sure that this girl was the one. This girl was now the new girl of his dreams. How convenient. And it so happens that she happens to be a princess, and Abdullah has entered into her night garden. Now, obviously, Abdullah still thinks that this is a dream. Regardless, he makes his introduction under a false pretense. Because he thinks it's a dream, then his daydream of him being a long-lost prince should also hold true, right? So he introduces himself as Prince Abdullah, and he tells her the whole story about how he was kidnapped as an infant and so on and so forth, obviously the whole thing being his daydream. And he himself, obviously, being in a dream state at the moment, doesn't think anything reprehensible about giving her an introduction on false pretenses. And it seems that this princess, she is also rather educated, but to be honest, she is educated in books, but she thinks that Abdullah is a woman. Oh no, and why is that? It's because she has never ventured out of the castle, and she has never seen a single man besides her father. She even goes on to say to Abdullah that you cannot be a man, you have beautiful hair, men don't have hair on their heads, and they have a little bit coming out of their middle called a belly. You don't have that, so you cannot be a man. So, you can go wild on the comments about how absurd this whole situation is. Anyway, Abdullah goes to great lengths to try and convince her that men come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and he proposes this. When him and the princess would meet the next time, he would come with a collection of pictures, all of men, to show the princess that men do indeed come in many different shapes and sizes and shades and colors and what have you, to prove his point that he is correct and she has misjudged this situation. And boy, am I putting it so politely right now. So anyway, this meeting lasts for about an hour, and then it is time for them to part, and Abdullah, thinking nothing too much of this, goes back to sleep on the magic carpet which has been in the garden this whole time. And when he awakes in the morning, and this time he has a bit of an earache. And why is that? It's because his nightcap is no longer on his head. When he went to sleep the previous night, he did have it on, and he thinks that maybe it just dropped off while he was sleeping, but he cannot find it anywhere in his booth. And what does this mean? This means that the whole dream that he had about the princess and the garden was not actually a dream. In his sleep, he must have commanded the carpet to take him to that garden. Whatever the hell he was saying and whatever the hell he was dreaming about. Of course, we know his dream, but damn, you must be some sleep talker to actually command a carpet to do that for you. Anyway, we'll get more into the nitty-gritties of how this carpet actually works. But now he is convinced and he is elated at the fact that the garden was real, and more importantly, the princess whom he met was definitely real. And what is the name of this princess, I must say, before we move any further, which she had mentioned to him in their first introduction. The name of this princess is Flower in the Night. Like, that is her entire name. The whole thing is her name, Flower in the Night. And it does have its charm, its beauty to it, doesn't it? I mean, definitely something straight out of 1001 Arabian Nights. Anyway, moving on. So Abdullah decides that he has to make good on his promise to bring Flower in the Night all these portraits of men, so that she can actually understand that men are very different and not every man has to look like her father, and so on and so forth. So he makes good on this promise. He goes to the bazaar and asks the artist to do this, and there's some interesting shenanigans that happen around that, because when people hear that he's buying pictures, then people want to start selling their old pictures of their dead grandmothers and what have you to him, and he said that no, I'm only going to purchase pictures of a man. But anyway, I digress. Now, there is also an interesting development. Naturally, Abdullah, after breakfast, had tested this magic carpet to see that it still obeys him. And he finds that right now, it doesn't even rise 2 feet in the air, as it had done when the stranger first set foot in Abdullah's booth. Now, this is rather disturbing, because although it has definitely been proved to Abdullah anyway, that whatever he had seen the previous night was not a dream, it was definitely real, and Flower in the Night definitely existed and was waiting for Abdullah to arrive with these portraits of the men that he had promised. Yet he could not get this magic carpet, which did work yesterday, perfectly fine. Now he can't even get it to do a basic command. This is naturally disturbing. Nevertheless, he does manage to go to sleep that night, and lo and behold, he wakes again in the garden of Flower in the Night. And he presents the images, the pictures that he had chartered the artist to paint in the bazaar of Zanzibar, and Flower in the Night goes through them. As the story goes, she goes through all these pictures of handsome men, men who are not so handsome, dark light, what have you, every single shade and size of man that you have, the artist had painted. He even put in a self-portrait somewhere in the middle. Flower in the Night went through all of them and decided that she loved Abdullah and she was going to marry him. I know that's rather ridiculous, but we'll save the commentary for a little bit later. Now, Flower in the Night basically has given off hints that she might be expected to marry the Prince of Okistan by her father, who wants to secure this allegiance between the two, shall I say, the two dominions of these people. I was going to say another word, but that would be too spoilery. And Flower in the Night had never seen this man, obviously. She had never seen a man besides her father. Now she has decided that Abdullah is the one she is going to marry. So obviously, this is the best news for Abdullah, isn't it? But now, obviously now, since you have to get married, there are other things you have to think about, because now Abdullah realizes that he had given his introduction under false pretenses. Now, would that be fair to this princess? Yes, princesses do get married to princes, but Abdullah isn't an actual prince. That whole story of him being a long-lost prince is something that he invented in his head. And if you were to blurt that out right now, the relationship that he has so far built with Flower in the Night may not go according to plan, or it may jeopardize everything that he has made progress with until this point. Nevertheless, he does explain that the issue that he has is not leaving Zanzibar, because they are definitely going to elope. That's the only chance they have at getting together, right? So that's not the problem. The issue is that he doesn't know exactly what gets this magic carpet to work. Whatever the code word is, he does say it in his sleep. And a point I should mention is that the previous day, when he was testing out the carpet, in order to find out what this magic word or the password is for this magic carpet to start working, he went through practically the whole dictionary, starting at aardvark, and then he ended off at somewhere with the letter Z, Zeitgeist or something. So pretty much the whole dictionary, and nothing worked. Anyway, Flower in the Night, being the educated girl that she is, despite the gaps in her knowledge, being the educated girl that she is, theorizes that perhaps it would be a word, a common word, spoken in a rather eccentric way, because magic carpets apparently are supposed to be used in times of emergency to get away from trouble as quick as possible, which is shrewd logic. It makes sense. And she also theorizes that perhaps it is only activation, or only when you start using the carpet for the first time, that you need to say out this password. After that, there are two possibilities. It'll keep on working until it is returned to the place where it started working, or it'll keep on working until it touches ground. So to test this, Abdullah quickly says, "Oh, that's easy," and then gets on the carpet and says, "To my booth." And in a quick swish, he is back at his booth. So I guess this basically proves the first theory that Flower in the Night had, which was that it will keep on working until it is returned to the place where it started working, not until it touches ground. Okay, so now they have an idea of how this carpet works. So Abdullah is now basically set. He has come back to his booth for the night, but he's basically set to elope on this magic carpet with the girl of his dreams, right? Well, let's progress further in the plot and find out. So the next day, Abdullah, being very elated, he theorizes that Flower in the Night is a princess. She is going to be a tad bit expensive for someone like me to actually take care of, so I need to make sure that I've got the proper money. So he sells a good portion of his stock in carpets, and then of course he does the usual stuff that guys do before weddings. He goes to the public baths, he gets some fresh clothes, he even has a shave, which I'm not sure what the effectiveness of that is, since Abdullah is described as having 6 hairs above his lip, so I don't know what the hell he was shaving, but anyway, he got a shave, and he is about to go on his business. And this morning, one of his father's first wife's relations, I said I wasn't going to say that again, but I always end up saying it, Abdullah's relatives, right? They summon him to the big carpet emporium, which was what Abdullah's father had left off for them. He left Abdullah a little booth and enough to basically fend for himself, but the father's first wife's relationships, he had left them a big emporium. Anyway, Abdullah decides that, I don't get along with these people, but this is probably the last day I have to do any of this. After tonight, Flower in the Night and I are going to elope, and we're going to live happily ever after somewhere far, far away from Zanzibar and far, far away from these people. So he just decides to roll with it. He'll entertain their request one last time. So he goes to their booth, and here the relatives reveal that they have a prophecy, one which was made about Abdullah at the time of Abdullah's birth and presented to his father. And what does this prophecy read? The gist of it is that it says, addressing the father of Abdullah, "Your son will not follow you in your trade. A few years after your death, he will be raised above every single man in Zanzibar." Rather vague, I know, but I guess that's how prophecies are supposed to be anyway. And Abdullah at this point understands why his father had been disappointed in him. He understands that because he wasn't going to follow in his father's trade, Abdullah's father would take a bit of a dislike to that, if you will. And now Abdullah's relatives, the ones who had summoned him to this booth, had seen the signs. The rumors had gone out the previous day that Abdullah was mad and he was buying pictures, and he had, to mitigate this somewhat, he might have uttered a statement here and there saying that I plan to diversify my trade and get into the business of selling pictures. Now, Abdullah's relatives, they got the gist that he is showing the signs of being raised above every single man in Zanzibar because he has this sort of charisma to him. What if he gets employed by the vizier, and what if he becomes the sultan's right-hand man and all these sort of things? It was a bit of a stretch in their reasoning, but I guess when you're that paranoid and you're that interested in making a fortune out of your relative and him being raised above every single man in the land, I guess you need to stretch your reasoning every now and again. But all the signs were there that Abdullah was going to fulfill the prophecy sooner rather than later. And they decided that if this was going to be the case, then they were not going to be left out. If Abdullah was going to be raised above in status, then they would go along with him. They would also have to be raised in status. And how do they devise this to happen? Well, they devise, just so you know, just to set the scene, they had brought him into this emporium, this carpet emporium, and right now, as Abdullah was reading the prophecy, they locked every single door to make sure that he couldn't run out now, because they had brought in 2 fat women. I'm not making this up, this is in the book. 2 extremely fat women, one dressed in pink, one dressed in yellow, who were covering their faces and kind of giggling, and they wanted Abdullah, right now, right here, to take these 2 fat women as his wives. And these 2 fat women were also related to Abdullah in a kind of distant way. I think they were closer relations to these relatives who were setting up this marriage for him. And obviously this is setting Abdullah's plans into jeopardy, because Abdullah was supposed to elope tonight with Flower in the Night. And of course, the law of Zanzibar allows men to have as many wives as they want. Again, Oriental, not Islamic. But he didn't think that Flower in the Night would take kindly to sharing him with these 2 fat women, and he didn't even think that these 2 fat women would allow the magic carpet to fly in the first place, because they were too damn heavy. I hope that's not a diss. So going forward, Abdullah now has to figure a way out of the situation with the only weapon he has, which is his wit. To make matters worse, the relatives have brought in a magistrate to have the marriage registered immediately. Damn, these guys plan ahead. They are not joking around. They mean serious business. Now, Abdullah, what he does to overcome this hurdle, he invents a fabrication. And he says that he had taken a vow which would prevent him from getting married at the present moment. And he did not understand the significance of the vow because he was but a tiny child when his father had him make it in front of another magistrate. But now he understands that it is part of the prophecy. This is all a fabrication, mind you. And he says that he cannot take a wife until he has, in actual fact, been elevated above every other man in Zanzibar. That being said, the relatives' plans are thwarted for now. The magistrate does try to prod Abdullah here and there, but Abdullah obviously gives a very generic description about the magistrate in front of whom he had registered this vow, because apparently in Zanzibar, for a vow to have legal effect, it must be registered with the magistrate. So Abdullah gives a very bare bones description, and for now, he is safe. So Abdullah returns safely and unmarried for now, unmarried to two fat women. He returns safely to his booth and falls asleep on the magic carpet. And what do you reckon happens next? Well, obviously, he wakes up in the blissful garden of Flower in the Night. He spots his princess, and he signals for her to come to him, that he may take her hand, and they may fly away on this magic carpet, away to a distant land, and live happily ever after. And so Flower in the Night comes running, laughing heartily. Unlike those fat women who just giggled. How could a proper woman giggle, according to Abdullah? At least Flower in the Night was so beautiful, so intelligent, and now she was running to him. He could almost feel the embrace of victory. Just then, there was an arm that wrapped around Flower in the Night. Hideous, dark. Another hand clasped her mouth so that she wouldn't let out a scream. Abdullah made out a hideous face and two giant wings. And before he knew it, the princess whom he loved had been kidnapped by a Djinn. Abdullah ordered his magic carpet to follow after the Djinn. But alas, the carpet did raise up a few feet, but it couldn't follow the Djinn. Figures, the Djinn probably possessed an advanced form of magic that the carpet could not follow it, because it would have been thwarted in its attempts to do so. And Abdullah, to make matters worse, hears the clamoring of the guards coming. Realizing that this battle is lost, he has to return crestfallen to his booth. So he does, and he weeps in the manner of Zanzibar, beating his chest because the princess whom he loved has now been kidnapped by a Djinn of all creatures. He didn't sleep that night, and the next morning when the Sultan's group of northern mercenaries were making their way to his booth with their clink-clank of their armor, he didn't notice, nor did they notice when they bust in and basically arrested him. He didn't know what he was being arrested for, but ultimately he found himself in the presence of the Sultan of Zanzibar. Guess what? Flower in the Night definitely was a princess, because she was the daughter of the Sultan of Zanzibar. And now the Sultan wants Abdullah executed, and he knows that it's definitely Abdullah who kidnapped his daughter, because they found Abdullah's nightcap in Flower in the Night's night garden. So that's where the nightcap was, after all. Moreover, they had found portraits of not all the portraits, but a good portion of the portraits that Abdullah had given to Flower in the Night. Now, before Abdullah can be executed, he does blurt out that he is not married to Flower in the Night, and this makes the Sultan stop. Why? Because Flower in the Night, when she was born, a prophecy was made about her as well, and that prophecy was that she would marry the first man she would see who was not her father. So, Abdullah not being married to Flower in the Night yet could not be executed, and the Sultan's reasoning for this is simple. Even I, the Sultan of Zanzibar, cannot go against fate. He has no intention of challenging fate on this issue, so he has to find Flower in the Night, get her married to Abdullah, and then he can dissolve the marriage by having Abdullah executed. Now, obviously, Abdullah, trying to reason with the Sultan that it was a Djinn who had taken away his daughter, he gets the slip a little bit for now, but he is sent to the dungeons because no one wants to hear this oh-so-convenient story about a Djinn stealing away the princess. And it so happens that Abdullah, not having any other way to escape, finds himself after some time in the presence of the magic carpet once again. And guess who's on top of the magic carpet? It's the dog of Abdullah's neighbor, Jamal. This dog is notorious for wanting to bite every single human being in existence that is not Jamal, but because Abdullah has had some camaraderie with Jamal in the past, he makes an exception to Abdullah. His breath smells like squid because that's what Jamal feeds it, and Jamal is quite the cook. Jamal specializes in cooking squid, and he feeds that to his dog as well. How charming. Anyway, so this dog fell asleep on Abdullah's carpet and it made its way to him. And now Abdullah, jumping onto the carpet, makes his escape with the dog. Now this carpet follows no rules of physics whatsoever. It goes through walls, it goes through nooks and crannies here and there. We shouldn't concern ourselves with this because it is magic at the end of the day. Abdullah makes a stop to his booth. Jamal is over there. He drops off the dog and gives him some parting cash so that he may save himself from the army of the Sultan, and then makes his way to the desert on this magic carpet. And there's a bit of an incident there where someone chases him with the intention of stealing the magic carpet, most probably, but then he discovers that if he flatters the carpet, then the carpet is more responsive to his commands. And so he is able to overtake the camel rider by flattering the carpet and basically coaxing it to go about 2 or 3 times faster than a normal camel would. And so he does proceed in the desert until he smashes into a sand dune, tosses over into an oasis camp of a band of bandits, led by none other than the legendary bandit leader who had kidnapped the young Abdullah in his daydreams, Kabul Akbar. And guess what Kabul Akbar has with him? It's revealed that he has in his possession a magic bottle which houses a genie, which will grant the wishes of his master, but only 1 wish a day. Now, this is basically where I want to end off the plot summary of Castle in the Air, but needless to say, the genie in his method of granting wishes is quite malicious. First of all, when the genie is summoned from his bottle, he made a vow to himself that whoever let him out would be turned into a toad, so the 2 bandits who did actually do that ended up becoming toads. And it sounds like a once-off funny incident, but I appreciate Diana Wynne Jones and her ability to take little incidents that seem very trivial and as if they would not contribute to the main plot and how it would actually climax, but this is actually an interesting point. And Abdullah ultimately, by help of this genie, of course he leaves the company and gets free of the company of these bandits, ends up in a completely different country altogether, hooks up with a soldier who had been fighting in a war on the opposite side of said country. I don't want to mention its name for fear of taking the fun out of it. It is too spoilery in my opinion. I hope I won't slip and actually mention it further down the line. So he hooks up with this soldier, and then they go on a quest to go and rescue Flower in the Night. That is the recap of about a third or so of the book, Castle in the Air. Now, before we get into the themes proper, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the prose of the Zanzibis, how the Zanzibis talk in the flowery language that they have. For example, there is an incident in which Abdullah refers to a group of people, "O moons of many monarchs' eyes," and he talks about how help freely given is the best type of help. And once again, to try and quote directly, it's not so easy when you're going by memory of what you've heard in the audiobook. So I believe he says something along the lines of, "And freely given it will be. I will work to extinction for your aid, only craving one small boon in return. So we can see how flowery this tends to be and how poetic almost this language is. Once again, we can clearly see the influence of 1001 Arabian Nights. It almost feels as if it is a direct translation of very old Arabic text. We know that Arabic can get rather rhythmic when it comes to poetry, but even in certain aspects of conversation. When it comes to Arabic poetry in particular, I have not studied it in great depth, but Arabic poetry has what we call bahar. Now that literally translates in English as oceans. So there are certain meters, certain patterns that poems have to adhere by. Of course, nowadays, as we have progressed, Arabic poetry, just like English poetry, tends to become more free form, which I guess is a modern innovation, but historically Arab poetry was always in certain pentameters. For those of you who've studied literature, Shakespeare for example, and other poets of course, we see that there is a pentameter, there is a rhythm within certain poems and sonnets that is maintained while the message is being conveyed. So Arabic has got something similar. There are certain pentameters that poets have to adhere by when they are actually composing their poetry. So that was a little A-side that I was making a point that the speech of the Zanzibis really reminds me of this. Of course, it can get a bit pretentious, it can get rather sycophantic at times. It really sounds like you are just sucking on someone's boot to get them to do something for you. It does have its pros and cons. Now in Zanzibar, everyone talks like that. It is custom. At the beginning of the book, when the stranger is selling Abdullah the magic carpet, he uses some sort of, shall we say, flowery language. However, he uses it in a way to diss and insult Abdullah, because he's a bit more straightforward, and he does do a lot of things to kind of tick Abdullah off, but Abdullah manages to kind of keep his cool in that situation. That being said, when Abdullah is transported to the new country by help of the Genie, where he meets the soldier, over there, the first place that he visits is an inn. And when he speaks to the lady who works there, the innkeeper, he refers to her as Jewel of the Wayside. And she takes this really, really kindly. She takes such a liking to Abdullah, even though he is a first-time customer. And she is really impressed by this. And other people in that country that Abdullah visits are also impressed by the way he is polite. But not everyone is. The magic carpet obviously takes a great liking to Abdullah by virtue of its magic, because Abdullah is flattering it, and it really seems to like this flattery that it does his bidding whenever he flatters it properly. But the Genie, on the other hand, when Abdullah tries the same trick with the Genie, then the Genie at one point openly just snaps and says how much he hates this flattery and how he wishes that Abdullah would just be a bit more straightforward when it comes to making wishes with the Genie, which he eventually does come to do. Now, on the point of being straightforward, one of the themes that we see in Castle in the Air is the theme of deception, or not exactly deception, but how things aren't always as they seem. The themes of pretenses and disguises are always played along with throughout the course of this novel. So with pretenses, obviously, Abdullah, when he meets Flower in the Night, obviously he introduces himself under a false pretense. Now, he may have originally tried to justify that by saying, well, it was probably a dream, so if his daydream was thought to be true, and he just introduced himself under the pretense of this daydream that he had, it shouldn't have been all that reprehensible, right? Well, perhaps not. This is more of a philosophical question, but he does show remorse for introducing himself to Flower in the Night once he verifies that she is indeed a real princess, and the entire escapade of going into that garden was definitely a real encounter. He does come to regret it. I believe I mentioned this in my plot preview that I've just done now, but also later on in the novel, it does kind of eat into his heart that he introduced himself to the love of his life under false pretenses, but later they managed to solve something out. And the other thing about not being straightforward, you see, with deception, and Abdullah in particular, when things aren't as they seem. You see, he has never enjoyed the company of his father's first wives' relations. I cannot believe I said that again, but God. His father's first wives' relations are not on the best of terms with Abdullah. And yet, instead of being direct with them and telling them that he would rather have his own way and do things the way he sees fit instead of being nagged by these people whom he could care less about, he still engages with them in the same flowery type of conversation. He never says anything directly, and of course he had to use his wits to get out of that situation where they tried to get him married to those two fat women. He may not have succeeded had he decided on a more coarse, a more crass, a more brash course of action. But the point of the matter is that had he been more direct with them from the very beginning, would they have attempted this at all? The answer to that probably would be, yeah, they probably would have been looking at the nature of these people and what exactly they wanted to gain from their relationship with Abdullah. But that being said, in the real world, if we can take a parallel, in the real world, definitely to be more direct at times, instead of sugarcoating or masking the words that we're trying to say with people we are related to or otherwise, can help us in mental health. And I think that when it comes to Abdullah as well, had he been more direct with his relatives, although we don't really see him being a character who is caught in the traps of anguish and someone who is melancholy, at least not in regard to the way that his relatives treat him. If he falls into that mood, it's because he can't find flower in the night. So I think that if he had been more direct, I know it's not a real character and we shouldn't delve too deeply into the psychoanalysis of a character who hasn't been fleshed out in this regard, but perhaps he would have been at more peace had he been more direct in telling his relatives exactly how he felt. But also when it comes to Abdullah's relatives, he comes to the conclusion at the end of the novel that he did rather enjoy being wicked to them. And on this point, I would also like to mention that there is a Djinn who is introduced later on in the novel, and his name is Hasruel. And Abdullah knows this Djinn because he's kind of famous. At least they learn about him in school in Zanzibar. And his name is listed amongst the good Djinns. And if you're a Djinn whose name is listed amongst the good Djinns, that means they don't actually have to fear you. But because of certain aspects of Hasruel and certain events that have occurred in his life, he is basically forced to do certain acts which are nefarious. Now, Hasruel also comes to the conclusion at the end of the story, once these events have come to pass, that he did rather enjoy being wicked because after all these millennia, how many years he lived of being such a goody two-shoes, he actually got to go out there and do something fun for a change. And the same applies to the soldier that Abdullah meets in that new country that he travels to. This soldier also is under a disguise. This disguise wasn't something that he donned upon himself. It was actually a curse, we can say, that was placed upon him. So this soldier also, when he finally comes to his senses, he also comes to the conclusion that when I was going around that country robbing robbers, I did rather enjoy it. So now, what is this plot point that is being analyzed over here? We see that three characters, Abdullah, Hasruel, and the soldier, all have enjoyed wickedness in their own ways. But is this necessarily a blameworthy trait? Is this necessarily something that turns them evil? I feel that Diana Wynne Jones over here is highlighting an internal conflict within the characters, an internal sense of anguish, but just having a sense of enjoying something that is bad or wicked, does that necessarily propel one towards the evil side? Of course, if someone indulges in it and engages in it day in, day out to the point that they have consumed themselves in evil deeds and enjoying wickedness as it is put in the novel, then perhaps it is easier for them to sway towards evil. But the truth is, every single one of us, all characters, even in the semi-realistic novel that we have in Castle in the Air, it's got plenty of fantastic elements into it. It's got plenty of elements of reality imbued into it as well. So these characters also, within them, every single one of them, there is a sense of good and there is a sense of bad. The genie grants the wishes of his master. But he has to induce some sort of maliciousness with those wishes. If you make a wish for something, then he has to do something bad that will result as a consequence of that wish. But at the end of the novel, when the genie's true identity is revealed, we realize that this genie is not actually evil incarnate. He is a rather complex character who puts on a rather gruff, a rather extroverted exterior as a means of, shall we say, security, as a means of coming out confident. So he also has a sense of good and a sense of bad. But just because at certain points, certain people make us feel a certain way. In Abdullah's case, it wasn't his fault that relatives were horrid to him. And it was very clear from the outset that the relatives had their own nefarious agenda and nefarious intentions in regards to Abdullah's prophecy from the beginning. So if he did not like their company, if he felt uncomfortable with them, if he felt the need to distance himself from them and not be in their company and not having that sort of admiration that you would expect to have for family members, this isn't something that was Abdullah's fault. The same goes for the soldier. He was under a curse, so when he was doing all those things, he wasn't in his proper senses. And Hasruel also, I guess, has to come to this conclusion that although he is a good jinn who enjoyed doing the wicked things, he also needs to come to the conclusion that this doesn't necessarily make him a bad jinn. There is good and bad within all of us, but it is our choice as to which aspects of ourselves that we amplify. I think that is a very tacit message that we can exemplify in everyday conduct. And it is also for this very reason that I believe the final villain of Castle in the Air comes out more complex compared to the Witch of the Waste in Howl's Moving Castle. Howl's Moving Castle had the Witch of the Waste, who is kind of a big bad for the sake of being a big bad. She really has very few, if any, redeeming qualities. It's only at one point when I believe Howl mentions that she is a lady who is in need of love, or at least she was so many years ago. And because of her isolated sort of nature, that is what kind of drew Howl to her in the first place. This is talking about the first novel. Now, in light of everything I just said about the good and bad being in all of us and how it is our choice to amplify which of the two we want to, so the final villain of Castle in the Air, for this reason, comes out more complex because he also exemplifies both good and bad qualities, and he also exemplifies a bit of immaturity, a quality of not actually comprehending the entire situation because of his nature. So that is also something that we need to take cognizance of, and also the fact that deception is what wins the final battle in Castle in the Air, as opposed to Howl's Moving Castle. Now, notice that when I say that there's a more complex villain in Castle in the Air, and the final battle in Castle in the Air is a bit more sophisticated than Howl's Moving Castle, I'm not saying that I prefer this book or this final battle or this villain necessarily to Howl's Moving Castle. They are both good iterations. What I am making the point is that some of the aspects Diana Wynne Jones has definitely improved on, and she definitely introduces more complex points and more complex effects she achieves in this iteration of her writing. So the final battle is basically an entire stooged up play. It's basically everyone has their positions and their roles to fulfill, and it's an elaborate ploy. And yeah, that's all I can say without getting too deeply into spoilers, whereas Howl's Moving Castle was more of a direct fight, which was good as well. It was satisfying, but this one is equally satisfying. Now, moving on, we talked about the innate nature of being good and bad, and it's our choice to which one we amplify. In that same realm, we must also talk about the daydreams that all of us have. Now, if we harken back to the title of this novel, Castle in the Air, now that is usually a phrase that we use to refer to daydreams, and it is used in that context at the beginning of the novel, where talking about Abdullah's daydream, Diana Wynne Jones describes the whole thing as a castle in the air, meaning it's just something that he's making up and pulling up to be such a grand scheme, whereas in actual fact it doesn't actually exist and holds very little weight. And even if you were to look at it logically, the daydream that Abdullah had about his father finding him in the desert. First of all, a 2-year-old child walking through the desert like that, and then being found by a Zanzibi of all people in the desert. The Zanzibis were not really renowned for their bravery, so the chances of that happening the way he was daydreaming about it, they are really, really slim. So when it comes to daydreams, what is it about Abdullah that makes his daydreams so unique? Well, Abdullah's daydreams, almost in their entirety, come to life, and they are not always to his benefit. For example, Abdullah has had this daydream of how he was a 2-year-old child and he trudged through the desert, and ultimately he got found by the man who claimed to be his father. Now, when Abdullah escapes from Kabul Akbar and those band of bandits, he actually does trudge through the desert, and he comes to the conclusion that his daydream is becoming true, but he also realizes in our daydreams we leave out so many details. And when our daydreams come true, when Flower in the Night's daydream, the whole daydream of getting into a garden and having this beautiful girl, that came true, that was enjoyable. But this daydream of walking through the desert, he didn't account for the fact that it was so damn hot. He didn't account for the fact that he was going to be so damn thirsty, and he didn't account for the fact that there was sand getting in to every nook and cranny of his clothes. So it was really, a really uncomfortable experience. So that's something that we need to be cognizant of when it comes to our daydreams, that we shouldn't always be wishing for things that we do not have, because it may not always be to our benefit. And there are also some other places where the theme of daydreams is played with. For example, in the new country that Abdullah goes to by help of the Genie, there is one point when he and the soldier are asleep in the woods, and Abdullah has a dream, quote unquote, a dream about a big black Djinn that is sitting on his chest in the form of a black panther. And he thinks it's a dream. In the morning they wake up and they find a black cat over there. So yeah, not exactly what he was dreaming about, but there was a reality to that. So Abdullah must have been half asleep when the cat had first climbed onto his chest, and he thought it was a Djinn, and it was sitting on his chest and everything. Cats do that, alright? So there was also an interesting way that Diana Wynne Jones introduces this point and plays with it, moreover. And then Abdullah's entire journey, basically the whole concept, the whole journey that he undertakes, is basically all his daydreams coming true, including the finale, which I will not spoil. And then finally, the most prevalent theme, and one which we have to spend the most time on, and that is the theme of fate, very much similar to Howl's Moving Castle, in which Sophie had decided at the beginning that she was going to be unlucky because she was the eldest of 3, and we've gone into that in much detail in the previous episode. Now here, it is similar in some aspects, but at the same time it comes in through a different angle. Here the theme goes into fighting for what you believe in, even if it be against fate. So let me explain. When it comes to the prophecies of Abdullah and Flower in the Night, now Abdullah's prophecy, we've come to the conclusion, is really vague. It can mean anything. It can mean elevation and status. It can mean that he was elevated on a wooden plank after he was executed. It could mean, honestly, it's really open to interpretation, whereas Flower in the Night is more clear. Now, the Sultan of Zanzibar, when he had found out that Abdullah and Flower in the Night had not solemnized their marriage yet, so he has come to the conclusion that even him being the mighty Sultan of Zanzibar, literally the guy at the top of the pecking order, he cannot go against fate, because fate is something that you do not fight. Now this is logical, but this is in contrast to Abdullah, who somewhere down the middle of the novel comes to the conclusion that he will openly challenge fate. And I mean, the whole thing, the whole story of Abdullah, is it not an example, a journey into challenging fate? If Abdullah had just resigned when he had been imprisoned, if Abdullah had just decided that he was going to die and wait for something to happen to him, this story would not have happened. Or at the very least, it wouldn't have had the happy ending that it did. So Abdullah, from the beginning, was fighting for what he believed in. But later on in the novel, when he sees that he ends up wasting the wishes that the genie grants him, and that the genie is rather malicious when it comes to granting the wishes. This genie is nothing like the one in Aladdin. He's not jovial, he can be witty, but he's not funny. He can crack a joke every now and again, but it's usually at the expense of Abdullah. Abdullah may be the butt of the joke, or whatever the case may be. Now, when this happens, Abdullah decides that, the prophecy, when it comes to Flower in the Night, I was the first person that she saw after her father. So, it fits that I would be the person that she has to marry. That is what fate has decreed, and even the Sultan decided that he was not going to step on fate in that respect. So Abdullah said, okay, from now on, instead of me consciously trying to use this genie to get closer to Flower in the Night, because every time I try to do that, I end up getting further, or my journey is not progressing the way I would like it to, I am from now on purposefully going to waste every single wish. I'm not going to wish for anything related to Flower in the Night. I'm not going to wish for anything that relates to me getting closer to her. I'm going to wish for completely unrelated things. Fate is going to have to course correct and then take me to Flower in the Night, whether I like it or not. So this is how daring Abdullah was as compared to the logical stance that the Sultan took. And in the end, it was Abdullah that was successful. And Abdullah is obviously the protagonist, so he has to be successful. But what is interesting and what is fascinating about this is that when Abdullah was pushed to a corner, when he was challenged by fate, what he did is that he fought back. And how did he fight back? With everything that he had. Now, this is interesting because this is a real-life lesson that we can apply. We don't have access to our written-down prophecies, and anyone who says that they do is just scamming you out of your money. And Islamically, you shouldn't be believing in this hocus-pocus anyway. So we don't have access to our written prophecies, so we may not be influenced in the way that Abdullah is to challenge fate and what have you. However, it is important for us to note that whether we acknowledge the presence of fate, quote-unquote fate, or not, fate can be for us. Fate can even work against us, quote-unquote work against us. But that is not for us to ponder on and reflect upon. Our job is to keep moving forward, to keep trudging on and doing the best we can with what we have right here and right now, always striving for improvement, always striving to get past the obstacle in front of us, and always striving to get to our end goals, to achieve our dreams. That is exactly what Diana Wynne Jones was conveying through this character of Abdullah. You don't need to have a genie and a magic carpet and a soldier and all these things. These are just metaphors to allow you to enjoy the story and at the same time take a lesson from it. So I hope that point was elucidated such that everyone can take a lesson from it. I don't do justice in the hour that I've spent reviewing this book to actually go into depth about how awesome it is. When it comes to rating it compared to Howl's Moving Castle, and in particular the locales that are visited, I do prefer Howl's Moving Castle. This book is not bad, it is good, but number one, because of the Orientalist nature of it, I am not drawn to it as much as I am to Howl's Moving Castle. But two, I just feel that Howl's Moving Castle had a bigger set of characters to work with, and it did a good job at working with them. Don't get me wrong, even in this book there are characters who are introduced at the beginning who you think have no particular relevance to the plot, but at the end we see that, oh no, they were relevant to the plot all along, and they had their own sort of influences. And I don't want to spoil the story, I keep on saying that, but if you just read the book, you will see how Diana Wynne Jones expertly uses characters. There are very few, if any, characters in this novel who are wasted, but Howl had a bigger set of characters and characters that I was attached to, and this might also be something of a biased point, which point isn't, but I feel that the locales that we explored in Howl's Moving Castle are a lot more enticing than anything that we saw here. Yes, we saw some mountains, we saw the desert of Zanzibar. There isn't much wonder to the desert of Zanzibar to begin with. nothing like Port Haven and the Chipping Valley and the place where Mrs. Fairfax lives and all these places. Now, it could also stem from a little bias that I have. I haven't watched the Hayao Miyazaki adaptation of Howl's Moving Castle, which is a loose adaptation. However, I have seen a few videos which I use for my study sessions. They are ASMR videos. Many of them are made by ASMR rooms, and you should check it out when you have the time. So these videos, inspired directly by Miyazaki's adaptation, give us a glimpse into Port Haven, into Kingsbury, into the Chipping Valley, and all these locales that we had visited in Howl's Moving Castle. Before I had read Howl's Moving Castle, I actually used to use these ASMRs for studying, so the visuals and the sounds of Port Haven and Kingsbury. Port Haven is hands down my favorite locale. It just gives me so much peace just thinking about it and visualizing Port Haven in my head, and it just reduces my anxiety. So before I read the novel Howl's Moving Castle, I already had a glimpse of this, so when I actually read the novel, it made it much easier to picture this more vividly compared to anything that I'm picturing here in Castle in the Air. So it might be a biased point, but I did feel that Howl's Moving Castle did a better job at world building and building up the locales that we actually visit in the course of the story, and also all the ridiculous Orientalist things that we've already gone to lengths to debunking and how they are un-Islamic whatsoever. I mean, seriously, this love at first sight is not organic at all. Abdullah literally comes to realize that he truly loves Flower in the Night when he sees those fat chicks, because he doesn't have any respect for them, but he has a sort of admiration that he realizes at that moment for Flower in the Night. I mean, this is ridiculous in the real world to think that someone can fall in love or fall deeper in love with someone else by looking at fat people. It doesn't make sense whatsoever. Feel free to disagree with me in the comments, but this is not a realistic love story at all. I feel Howl's Moving Castle and the way it portrayed certain love stories was more organic and more of a healthy image of love stories, that although I wouldn't fully encourage people to take lessons from that about how relationships work, I would definitely say that's a more realistic portrayal of relationships compared to Castle in the Air. But hey, it's the Orientalist nature of 1001 Nights, which is just rubbing off onto Castle in the Air. And also these things of forced marriages just for the sake of allegiances. I'm not saying they don't happen in the Islamic world. I'm not going to be an ignoramus over here. But as much as people want to justify whatever it is they want to justify in the scope of Islam, the fact is that Orthodox Islam doesn't realize any element of force or really micromanaging people to this extent that you have to give away your daughters in marriage just because you want to secure an alliance and get that person's weapons and so on and so forth, and all the other Orientalist things that we have. But to be fair, looking back on this novel right now, the Orientalist tropes do not play so deeply into it. It's mostly at the beginning and the end where these Orientalist tropes are laid bare, but otherwise it still is a great novel for the reasons I've already highlighted. And of course, it's Diana Wynne Jones. How can you not love Diana Wynne Jones? The prose itself, I hope that she won awards when this novel actually came out. I'm told that the release of Miyazaki's film bolstered the popularity of both Howl's Moving Castle and Castle in the Air, of course, and later she went on to write the third book in the series, which we will be reviewing next time. So, should you read Castle in the Air? Yes, but just be cognizant of the Orientalist tropes and don't take them too seriously. But I would also recommend that you read Howl's Moving Castle before you read this. Not necessarily because the plots are intertwined to a great degree. However, if you have read Howl's Moving Castle, by the second and third acts of this novel of Castle in the Air, you will be fanboying or fangirling really, really hard, and it just makes it a more satisfying experience having experienced the land of Ingary through the eyes of Sophie and Howl, and now having to experience it through the eyes of Abdullah. Cool? So I hope everyone benefited from this intense book review, Castle in the Air by Diana Wynne Jones. Please go purchase the book on Audible, on Kindle, or on paperback if it's at your local library. I seriously envy you once again. Go purchase these books, support the authors, support the creatives. Leave your comments down below, subscribe, like this video, share with your friends and family, and get them to read as well, because readers are leaders. Until next time, this is your host, Moss, signing off. Assalamu alaikum.